Hello, I'm the storyteller. Thank you for choosing to stay here with me, on this journey tonight. I know you are looking for a story to lull you to sleep, something that is both gentle and makes you unable to take your ears off. Before we begin, if you find the stories I tell relaxing or accompanying your emotions during the night, please click like, register, and share to help the channel grow. You can also leave a comment. I read all the responses and appreciate your presence. Now, turn off the lights, curl up in a blanket. Relax your mind, and walk with me into a cold night. One night, place memory and dark mix, place reality more fragile than ever. Dark night fell, covering this ancient hotel. The space was quiet and dim, like a thick layer of fog covering every corner of the room and every narrow hallway. All sounds seemed to be swallowed up in the quiet space, leaving only the sound of shadows running along the smooth walls. Someone said that old hotels have secrets. But the secrets of this hotel, they are not just stories that people often tell each other late at night. When I checked in, a feeling of insecurity began to creep into my mind. It was a room on the top floor of the hotel, where there was only the cold silence of darkness for company. The wallpapered wall buckled at the corners, as if the place hadn't been cared for in a while. The faint light from the weak light bulb shines on the surface of the old furniture. But what made me feel the most chill was the table, a table that seemed to have existed for centuries, covered in dust. My eyes accidentally glanced over the mirror's surface, and that's when I saw something I couldn't forget. A tall, faint figure seemed to be standing behind me. It was just a fleeting presence, but it was enough to make me turn around. However, when I turned around, there was nothing, only emptiness. At that moment, I felt my heart pounding. Each beat seemed like it was about to break my chest. The hairs on my body stood up, my insecurity increasing. Am I being followed? The feeling of suffocation made me unable to sit still. I hurriedly left the room, my heart still beating loudly in my chest. As I lay in my room, trying to calm myself down, a strange feeling didn't leave me. The air seemed thick, heavy, and waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, footsteps began to sound again. The steps were strange, not of someone walking back and forth normally, but a sound of urgent steps, as if someone was in a state of fear and excitement. The footsteps got closer and closer, seemingly walking around my room. Cold sweat drenched my body. The door to the room shook slightly, then suddenly slammed shut, making me jump. I can't understand, is there someone in this room? Or, am I just imagining it all? Anyway, I don't dare risk lying down. With my mind tense and confused, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. Getting into bed, I decided to observe and listen. A few seconds later, the sound of footsteps rang out again. This time, they didn't just stop in front of the door, but there was another sound, soft, but clear, as if someone was dragging furniture inside the room. It seemed like there was nothing but darkness, there was no one else in this room, but the sounds continued, echoing in the space. The extreme fear made me feel like I couldn't breathe. I think I'm no longer alert enough to face the truth anymore. I began to doubt myself, wondering if everything was just a trick created by my own stress. But no, something was clear, something was unfolding before my eyes. It can't be just imagination. It can't just be paranoia. With a bold decision, I jumped up from the bed, walked to the door, and placed my hand on the doorknob. My hands felt cold, my breath seemed to be stuck in my throat. I grabbed the door handle, gently turned it, and the door opened. A dark space waited for me inside. The weak hallway light shines into the dark space inside. Entering, I saw a room that I couldn't explain, a long, dark hallway that didn't make sense given the size of the room. It opened up a strange space that I couldn't understand. But before I could observe further, the door slammed shut again, startling me. I hurriedly left the room, just wanting to escape this threatening place. I ran down the hallway, but everything became blurry. Confusion took over my mind. Finally, I arrived at the reception, telling my story with a feeling of despair. The receptionist, a young man, listened to my story without showing any surprise. He admitted that no one had rented the room I was in, and that nothing unusual had happened here. He offered to move me to another room, but a part of me, a strange part, told me I couldn't leave, that I had to face something I didn't understand. At that time, I no longer knew what to do. I thanked him, then returned to the room I rented. The door was locked tightly. But in my mind, I knew that I couldn't escape what had begun, couldn't avoid what was slowly unfolding. I felt as if I were being enveloped by a wave of claustrophobic fear. The air was thick, suffocating me. It seemed like the walls of the hallway were gradually narrowing, squeezing me into the middle of the space. Each step seemed heavier and heavier, as if the entire hotel was breathing around me, silently observing and filling the hallways with a dark, malevolent presence. My nails involuntarily dug deep into my palms, causing crescent-shaped pain, which felt like a sign that I needed to do something, needed to leave before something irresistible was looming. So I made a plan. Early in the morning when the sun comes up, I will leave, nothing can hold me back. If something in this hotel is determined to keep the truth hidden, I'll let it keep its turf. I won't be the only one to expose these dark secrets. But the night lasted forever and never ended. It felt like time seemed to slow down, trapping me in an endless space that I couldn't escape. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, and when I woke up, I realized I was lying on the floor, my back against the wall. The gray light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains, signaling that a new day was approaching. My limbs are stiff, my neck aches. But strangely, I was filled with a strange sense of calm. A peace as if I had just overcome a cycle of nightmares and survived. But then I realized, I hadn't changed my wrinkled clothes, I was still in the same state as last night, unable to understand what I had gone through. But there's no time to sit here and think. I started packing my suitcase hastily, my trembling hands searching for the zipper, my mind too determined at this point. I needed to escape this hotel before it completely destroyed my sanity, before I was completely engulfed in this claustrophobic space. When I walked down the stairs, I felt like a pair of invisible eyes were watching my every step, following me from behind. However, I forced myself not to look back. When I arrived at the reception desk, I found the desk empty, except for a handwritten note placed on a dull bell. The content on the paper was just a few words: "You can leave the key on the counter." Every fiber in my body wanted to rush out the door and never come back. But a feeling of morbid curiosity prompted me to glance over my shoulder once more, and then I saw a pale figure, a tall human being, standing silently in the corner of the room. Its eyes seemed to be observing me, cold and silent, telling indescribable secrets. My chest tightened, and a wave of fear rolled through me. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I had to turn away and quickly walk out of the hotel. The sun had just risen, and the cold morning air woke me up, restoring my senses with a sharp bite from the wind. There was a feeling of relief when I left there, but a part of me still couldn't erase that insecurity. Even though I escaped the hotel, the memories of the strange events still did not let me go. Late at night, I wake up and am convinced I hear hesitant footsteps right outside my bedroom door. My heart was pounding again, but I reminded myself that I was safe, I was far away from that place, far away from the unexplainable. However, a part of me still cannot rest assured, the feeling of insecurity still surrounds me. Since then, I can't stop thinking about that hotel. It feels like some living entity exists inside the chipped walls, an old wound of time festering. I couldn't fully understand its nature or purpose, but the feeling was that there was something dark and sinister that refused to let me go. Curiosity about those secrets still makes me fear that one day, that hotel will seek to expand its influence, will seek to take everything from me. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when I just want to sleep, those footsteps sound again, softly but clearly. Something from behind my door still calls to me, still reminds me that what I have witnessed, what I cannot fully understand, is not yet over. And perhaps, it's only a matter of time before it finds a way to reach me again. The atmosphere in the office that day was unusual, heavy, and seemed to stick to every space, as if the ventilation system had been turned off. Thin sweat stuck to my skin, making my shirt sticky, my hairline also soaked in sweat, and a sigh escaped my mouth. Sitting down in the chair in front of the computer, I tried to ignore the rising feeling of discomfort, and told myself to finish the job. But even in those tense minutes, I could not escape the absolute silence, broken only by the soft click of the keyboard and the ticking of the wall clock, which sounded unusually loud in the quiet space. I tried to focus on the spreadsheet, but my mind kept wandering. My eyes unintentionally turned towards the open door. I could hear rustling, or a rattling sound from the hallway every time I looked in. Each time, my heart beats a little harder, a little faster, and my anxiety increases. After about an hour of work, I decided to step away from my desk and grab a cup of coffee to calm my nerves. I told myself that a cup of coffee would help me stay awake and dispel the anxiety that was slowly squeezing my chest. I stood up, trying not to pay attention to the dead silence around me, so much so that even the rustling of my pants felt strange and uncomfortable. The feeling of shortness of breath came. It seemed like I was running through the hallway. My pulse was stronger than usual. I realized I was having trouble breathing. It felt like something was weighing heavily on my chest. The floor was shiny, reflecting my every step, creating a dim, sickly glow. When I approached the large glass window near the room, the light reflecting in the glass made me see a distorted image of myself. But then, I noticed something strange, a second figure, standing still, quietly behind me. It seemed to be looking straight at me, and immediately, the coldness from that figure invaded me. A cold shockwave spread from my fingertips to the depths of my body, my breath caught in my throat, and my heartbeat pounded violently in my ears. I turned around, almost tripping in panic, but there was nothing behind me. The room was still empty, and there was no one in the hallway. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart pounding, each panting breath breaking the silence. It feels like this whole space is watching me. Overhead lights illuminated the plain walls, but there was no darkness that could explain the feeling I had just experienced. My scalp tingled and sweat began to form on my temples. A cold feeling enveloped my body, as if the building's air conditioning had just turned on, but I couldn't hear anything from the vents. I told myself that perhaps my eyes were being deceived by the reflection in the glass, but part of me couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me. Trying to get my feet moving, I headed towards the break room, each step making me feel more and more like I was performing for an invisible audience. The coffee maker was the only source of sound as I approached. The machine hissed, then chirped as it brewed a new cup. That sound temporarily freed me from the feeling of insecurity, but still could not dispel the cold feeling that clung to me. I drank water from the tap to soothe my dry throat. That feeling never disappeared. When the coffee was finished brewing, I held the hot cup in my hand and returned to the office. I tried to calm myself down by mentally reviewing the tasks that needed to be completed, the remaining days of the week, but nothing helped ease my anxiety. Silence suddenly returned, covering everywhere like a shroud. One thought repeated in my head: I am not alone. No matter how many times I tell myself, I know that I'm not alone here. Every time I return to my desk, I continue my work, but my hands shake a bit when I type. My concentration was broken by the slightest change in the light. The longer I sat, the more convinced I became that something was lurking in the hallway, waiting for me to move. My imagination was overactive, fueled by horror movies and lack of sleep, but deep inside, I felt a primal fear that I couldn't explain. It doesn't let me go. Finally, I decided to turn on the music. Some music can help keep my mind from wandering. I put on my headphones, find a familiar playlist, and turn the volume up enough so I can still hear any noises outside. The gentle tunes help me relax a bit, and my heart rate gradually slows down. But then, suddenly, the lights in the office flickered, and something felt wrong again, as if I wasn't alone in this space. The lights in the room flickered for just a moment, like the tired eyelids of the building. Even though it was just a fleeting moment, it was enough for me to tear off my headphones, my eyes glued to the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. When they stabilized, I still stood still, not daring to take my eyes off them. 30 seconds passed like a century, and I listened to every single sound, as if the building were responding to me with a low mechanical whine, a sound that drifted through the ventilation ducts like a distant, untraceable groan. I realized I was gripping the edge of the table with such intensity that my palms turned white, then let out a shaky breath. I tried to laugh away my fear, comforting myself that it was just a normal electrical problem, but just as I thought that, the light emitted a brief signal, once again flickering across the room. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the hallway, a figure passing by the door. My heart pounded in my chest, and my whole body tensed. I unconsciously stood up and tiptoed towards the door. My breathing was short and rapid, and every time I inhaled, I felt like I was inhaling stuffy air. I looked out into the hallway, half expecting to see a figure lurking against the wall, but there was nothing. Everything was just dense silence, covering the entire space, weighing heavily on my ears with an annoying ringing sound, like an invisible signal from somewhere. I returned to my desk, trying to continue my work. My mind was spinning with a series of possible explanations. Could it be that the security guard downstairs is working around? But no, security guards usually announce themselves with a friendly knock on the door, or at least the jingling of keys. I wonder if some colleague stayed late without telling me? But time passed, my report was almost done, and the combination of stress and the cold feeling from the air conditioning made me shiver. The coffee is now cold. My palms were sweaty, leaving blurry marks on the computer mouse. I was sure I heard muffled footsteps outside the office, but every time I stopped typing, the noise disappeared. Finally, I decided to walk around the floor, half afraid that I would leave the office light on and venture down the hallway. The sound of my shoes echoed off the pure white walls, cutting through the silence. I glanced at the reflective glass as I passed by, unable to resist checking it out again. I only saw my reflection, pale round black eyes, tired expression. I breathed a sigh of relief, but then I noticed something else strange in the reflection. One of the doors at the end of the hallway looked slightly ajar. When I turned around to face it, I noticed the door was completely closed. A chill ran down my spine, the kind of feeling that made every hair on my body stand up. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I walked up to that door, just to confirm that it was locked, or at least really closed. A sign on it stated, "Storage room not in use." I never really bothered to explore. My hand trembled as I placed it on the doorknob. The cool feeling from my fist made me feel unnatural, different from my warm palm. I tried turning the knob, hoping it would lock, but it didn't. The door opened with a loud click. Darkness greeted me on the other side. My heart sank as a rush of adrenaline rushed through my body. I groped for the light switch and turned it on, the only light illuminating rows of metal shelves filled with old office supplies. The air inside was stagnant, stuffy, smelling of dust and cardboard. The storage room seemed deserted, just an abandoned room. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling. A moment ago, I caught a glimpse of something else standing in there, behind the rows of shelves. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. I walked into the room, telling myself I needed to confirm there was nothing there. A single light shined on, casting long shadows on the shelf. My eyes darted around the corners, the loud, incessant hum of the light bulb made me grit my teeth. I felt a sudden wave of nausea, as if the whole space was pressing down on me, constricting me. After a few tense moments, I backed out of the room, turned off the lights, and closed the door. I'm sure it's locked. This time, I pulled the handle to confirm, trembling, but nothing changed. I felt like I was captured in an inexplicable space. The strange feeling of fear as my hand pulled on the door, each time I clenched the handle was like a blow to my mind, causing me to force myself to leave and go back to the office. Determined to pack up and leave, I couldn't justify staying another minute, when my nerves were so strained that it was almost unbearable. As I walked down the hallway again, a sudden sound rang out on the floor, a faint dragging creak that chilled my blood through my veins. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, my body in flight or fight mode, my lungs heating up with each breath. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to punch a hole in my chest. I pushed all my senses forward, on high alert. The overhead lights continued to flicker intermittently, making each step feel like they were walking through snapshots of reality. At times, the hallway seemed to stretch as if the building itself was warping. The rhythm of each light seemed to become ever more unusual. I want to run, I want to get out of here, but I know that if I start running, I might not be able to stop. I just wanted to go into my office, grab my briefcase and get out. When we arrived, there was something outside the door, ajar. I remembered leaving it wide open, but now it was standing there, completely closed. My stomach twisted as I looked inside. The overhead fluorescent lights were off, and the only light came from the computer screen, which still displayed unfinished spreadsheets. But the rows and columns on the screen are flashing with random numbers. My chair sat at an angle as if it had been turned around. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed with indecision. Then, I heard a faint whisper, like a distant breeze blowing through a crack. At first I thought it might be the ventilation system, but no. It carried an unmistakable rhythm, and the blood flowed from my face. A cold sweat rolled down his temple. My eyes darted around the dim office looking for an explanation, but I couldn't. My breathing is now noisy and shallow. A creepy feeling crept throughout the body. I wondered if I was physically safe, or if a stranger had wandered in without me recognizing. Or something I can't understand. Primal instinct roared in my head, telling me to leave the office immediately. But my bag and keys were inside, and I refused to leave them behind. Gathering all my courage, I walked into the darkness. My heart was pounding, like a warning. My hand groped along the wall until I found the light switch. Hit the switch, the fluorescent lights above clicked and flickered. The room looked like usual except my computer screen was still glitching, with random icons. Then in the reflection of the screen, I saw that shadow again, standing right behind me. Color drained from my vision, and my lungs felt tight. I turned around, a gasp escaping my lips, but there was nothing there. I leaned back against the table, dropping a few papers on the floor. My muscles were so tense that I thought I might collapse under their weight. With shaking hands, I forced myself to turn off my computer, grabbed my bag, and staggered out into the hallway. The hallway lights flickered in an erratic rhythm, as if it was time for my heart to pound incessantly. I walked straight into the elevator, not daring to look at the reflective window or the dark corner of the hallway in front of the elevator door. I pressed the call button repeatedly, what felt like an endless wait stretching out each second as I tried to stay calm. I thought I heard footsteps behind me again, but every instinct I had refused to turn around, telling me that if I looked, I would see something I didn't want to see. When the elevator finally arrived with a sterile ding, I practically jumped inside and pressed the floor button. The doors slid shut, trapping me in a small fluorescent light box that felt almost as claustrophobic as the hallway. The bright overhead lights made the sweat on my face sparkle. I stared at the numbers of the digital floor counting down, counting in my head like a survival mantra. My heart beat faster as the elevator lurched, as if it might cause my breath to catch in my throat. Panic flooded my mind. I prayed it wouldn't trap me between floors. A chill ran through my body as the elevator groaned and continued to descend. I trembled, exhaling as the door opened into the hallway. My legs felt weak, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. The security desk at the ENT entrance was empty, even though there's usually someone there 24/7. My boss had previously sent a text about the security guard not being present. I felt as if I was going to leave to rest for a while, and I told myself that this was just normal. But the emptiness, darkness, echoing with menace in the air made me unable to feel secure. I crossed the hallway as fast as I could without even sprinting, even though my body almost wanted to bolt in fear. The door automatically slid open, and I stepped into a quiet street, bathed in the faint light of the streetlights outside. The cold night air slapped my face, and I swallowed, trying to calm the shivers in my body. I rushed to the car, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and each breath burned my throat. When I get in the car, I lock the door immediately. My shoulders sagged with relief, but my pulse refused to slow. I stared at the vague outline of the office building in the rearview mirror. It was tall and dark, with only a few lights on each floor indicating a brief electrical presence. I thought I saw a figure in one of the windows, perhaps on the floor, looking at me with unshakable intensity. Morbid fear curled in my stomach, and I looked away from the mirror, focusing on the engine as I drove home. My mind whirled with questions and fears, replaying every flicker of movement, every suspicious sound. Is it all just exhaustion and an overactive imagination? Or am I actually seeing something that my reason has struggled to classify as a product of stress? But primal terror overcame reason. I refused to yield everything I knew about the building, a once mundane place that now felt haunted by an oppressive force, an inexplicable presence. When I got to the apartment, I parked outside and was forced to look over my shoulder. Even though I was buried in the chair, I could still feel the adrenaline pounding through my veins, my muscles twitching with the remaining panic. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but the chatter from the screen only reminded me of how I felt my reflection staring back at me, as if I were overwhelmed with rejection. Even as I settled down and got ready for bed, every hour of the apartment building's eerie sounds made my heartbeat increase. I kept the light on in the hallway, unable to face the total darkness that night. The nightmares of the silent hallway and my independent reflection still wrapped around me, clutched in fear. Part of me knew that there was something in the office building that night, a presence that I couldn't identify or rationalize. Even though I escaped it, the memory of it clung to me, whispering in my mind that the line between what was real and what was imagined was not as solid as I once thought. I felt the eyes shrug into the back of my head, a voice in my mind begging me to turn back. The pine trees surrounding the property create an unsettling tone, and that chorus never seemed to stop when I got out of the car. A strange oppressive feeling enveloped me, as if that very night had followed me. Something about the silent plants and single porch light makes me struggle to get the most out of my seclusion without distraction. Other than a notebook for my laptop and a few books for inspiration, in my mind this rustic cabin would be the perfect place to focus and let creativity flow. Sure enough, the owner told me during a hasty call that this was the perfect place, where I could find the inspiration I'd lost over the past few months. I was hoping that a desk, small bedroom wallpaper, and a living area with a stone fireplace might help me get that back. However, the atmosphere was still quiet on the first night, and everything seemed normal, at least by the standards of an old wooden house in the woods. The floorboards creaked as the tall pines formed a fortress around the cabin. I discovered a small clearing about 100 yards from the porch, where the ground sloped down to a bed of rocks and moss, several pine trees standing close together on top of them. For a brief moment it seemed like an ideal paradise for a writer. But that feeling of peace disappeared Tuesday night. I had fallen asleep on the couch, awakened by the crackle of the fire on the clock, the overlay showing 3:14 a.m. Every heartbeat in my body began to beat faster as I realized that the peace of this place was threatened. The sound of my heart's heavy breathing seemed to get closer and closer, as if it were right next to the window. My skin was damp with sweat, and my fingers trembled as I blindly searched for the flashlight on the coffee table. I forced myself not to turn on the light, I could only keep the dim light of the flashlight. A few minutes passed, and I convinced myself that it was just a trick of my own, a joke on my nerves. However, my hand kept shaking for a long time, and it took more than an hour before I could lie down. My ears are attuned to every sound in the house again. The next day, I told myself that there must be a reasonable explanation. Someone had actually approached the house, must have left some trace. Concluding that it was just my own anxiety, I returned to my writing. However, the words slowed, and my concentration was clouded by the memory of last night's murmuring, perhaps coming from the alpendra near the front door. I took the flashlight and its small can, kept it in my pocket, and tiptoed out of the bedroom. Cold sweat rolled down the sides of the boards beneath my feet, they groaned, and each sound was amplified by the silent tension surrounding the cabin. The night air felt colder than usual, and my breath came in ragged gusts. It felt like a meeting, and I sat at the kitchen table, feeling the tightness in my chest that refused to let go. Even the morning light cannot dispel my mood. Realizing that this had become a loop, some presence was whispering outside the cabin that I couldn't dismiss as a mere hallucination. I began to examine every inch of the yard with desperate caution. That's when I discovered footprints on a piece of soft ground near the pine tree. They weren't clear, just faint marks, possibly the imprints of bare feet, but I couldn't be sure. These footprints led around the corner of the cabin, then disappeared into the thick grass, and my stomach flipped into view. I told myself that maybe they were old travelers, maybe hunters or vast hikers. But the emptiness outside is no longer soothed. I felt as if invisible eyes were lurking behind every tree, in an unjust chant in my ears. The imaginary image slid through the darkness, making my heart pound so hard it could have broken my ribs. At around 3 a.m., strange sounds appeared. The syllables sounded frantic and strange, a brief moment that froze me, convincing me that something was looking at me through the window. My eyes, I could feel, almost released the flashlight frantically shining it out, but all I saw were tree branches. I hardly slept after that, sitting on the couch, lying on the cushion next to my lap. Every muscle in my body was threatened, and I couldn't identify it. Deciding to leave early, the original plan was to stay for 2 weeks, but I was too shaky to concentrate on work, and any creative spark I had was drowned out by the terror. When I packed my things, my car was ready. I give one last look at the property. The pine trees shook their tops, clawing at the sky like claws. The cabin is stationary, nothing else. The atmosphere as I drove away was as if I were trying to rationalize events. Maybe it was just the wind combined with an overactive imagination. Maybe I'm playing a game of isolation and lack of sleep. Part of me wanted to believe that, but my memories made me decide otherwise. The owner then asked in an email if everything was okay. I didn't say I left earlier than expected. I responded in only the vaguest of terms, mentioning only that I had personal matters to attend to soberly. But in the early hours of the morning, I felt my heart beating against my ears, convinced that the same whisper was prominent right outside my window. And when I left, I understood that there are places where we invite ourselves in, places where we refuse. Places where stories older, darker than any we can conjure, echo again. My rational side still tried to dismiss it, but the wind and the psychological effects couldn't deny that those cabin woods weren't as empty as they appeared. Something followed me in the dark, circling the hotel, whispering at my doorstep. I stood stiffly, feeling a drop of sweat roll down my temple as I moved quietly, gingerly, step by step. It felt like someone was watching me from behind. Every sound I made seemed amplified by the tension in the air. My fingers trembled as I touched the doorknob, feeling strangely warm as I was buried in darkness. My throat tightened, and for a few seconds I could do nothing but watch the metal of the revolving door knob, as if guided by an invisible hand. I whispered to myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just the old mechanism of the door that was still stuck. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I felt like my chest was about to pop out of my body. Not a single shadow trembled, but an indefinable feeling made me take a step back. The door behind me suddenly turned locked, and I pressed my back against the wood, hearing the sound of difficulty for the next few minutes. The next day, in broad daylight, I tried to convince myself that everything was simply old and in need of renovation. It doesn't have to be something obsessive or dangerous, but my nagging anxiety makes even mundane tasks scary. I told a colleague on the phone that I was adjusting to my new home, but I couldn't escape the vague feeling that insecurity brought. One source implies the building was used as a boarding house for decades, but there are no official documents confirming that. A neighbor I encountered on the way home mentioned the building, in a hushed tone, saying the house had a reputation for providing creeps. She quickly changed the subject and redirected the conversation, but every time I thought about it, the uneasy feeling in my stomach surfaced. It was like a knot in my mind, an inexplicable worry that kept repeating and made me feel like I was stuck in a never-ending vortex. That feeling wouldn't let me go, like an invisible threat always clinging to me, not letting me escape. Memories of the revolving door knob and strange sounds coming from behind the wall kept swirling into my head. Every time I try to sleep, my head gets tense, and I feel the hairs on my arms stand up. My gasps echoed in the still air. I wanted to jump out of bed, but I couldn't summon the courage to open the door, to face something I couldn't explain. A rancid smell began to spread from the kitchen. Every time I flashed it, I saw it disappear in a moment. I lifted my flashlight, and a faint light shone out, but all I saw was thick, all-encompassing darkness. Every scratching sound coming from behind the wall makes me unable to feel at peace. It was as if they were toying with me, drawing me into a world I couldn't understand. The buzzing feeling in the air like a wild shadow on the wall made me unable to control it. I dropped the flashlight before I could pick it up violently, my knees almost giving out in fear. These events had a powerful presence, a malevolent force that wanted me to feel its anger, or its anguish, or both. My entire body felt trapped in an endless nightmare, and I began to question my sanity. Is the stress causing me to fall into a hallucination, or is there really something beyond the realm of interpretation targeting me? That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to crazy sounds downstairs. The sound of heavy footsteps, fast and shallow food. My palms left sweat stains on the flashlight, and I reached the living room. Everything was in perfect order, no chairs were overturned, no signs of vandalism. But a cold breath slid across my neck, and I let out a sad sigh. My stomach twisted with fear, and I almost tripped because my legs were weak and scared. I spent the next day so tired, my eyes so hard from lack of sleep, that even if I could find a scientific explanation, I still couldn't shake the feeling. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I turned around, feeling those eyes following my every move. I turned around, but there was no one, but the closet door opened in the darkness, revealing a faint stench. My chest tightened as I turned on the flashlight, shining it into the empty space in the wall. It is black, but the smell here is stronger, mixed with a sour smell. I shined my flashlight into a small alcove, where something glanced at me and pulled out a dusty metal box. The flashlight dimmed for a moment, and my heartbeat accelerated violently. I thought I might faint when I saw the old letters inside the box, ending abruptly with a farewell. The writer explains that they are leaving home forever, not mentioning what they believe is tormenting them, only saying that they can't take it anymore. That farewell letter was written in a curled hand, with the message that if anyone found this box, they should do the same, leave immediately. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to slow my breathing to avoid falling into a panic attack. At that moment, I realized that I was not just reading a relic of the past, but I was facing my own terrifying present. A wave of fear washed over me, cold as ice. Like a direct warning from someone who has endured what I am enduring. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every sound in the house was magnified, the dripping of the faucet, the hum of electricity, and the frantic beating of my heart. I hugged the box tightly, determined not to let this presence scare me. It's time to go. I gathered my most important items, wallet, phone, clothes. My rational side told me to grab more, but I didn't dare stay another minute. My lungs felt like they were on fire, I was panting in short bursts, my hands were shaking. As I walked down the stairs, I half expected the door to the outside to slam shut or lock itself, but no, there was just a sense of quiet anticipation in the air, as if the entity within the walls was watching to see if I would run or stand still. As I reached the front door, I felt a final rush of cold air behind me, a presence so close it gave me goosebumps, rippling across my skin. For a brief moment, I felt something looming over my shoulder, an invisible shape radiating malice and despair. My heart was pounding painfully. I gripped the door handle, opening it harder than necessary. The door banged against the wall, and a blast of cool night air hit me like a cleansing wave. I walked out, turned around and looked into the streetlight. The lobby looked innocently old. It was just a worn entryway in a house in need of care, but I knew what lay behind that veneer. There was a malice in those walls that no amount of renovation could erase. Even standing on the threshold, my skin felt prickly, the little hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like the house itself was breathing slowly like a living entity, heaving with anger at my departure. I left that night without bothering to lock the door behind me. My heart rate gradually slowed as I walked down the sidewalk. The farther I walked from the porch, the more weight I felt lifting from my shoulders with each step, but even now, I still couldn't completely shake off the oppressive feeling that clung to me. In those final moments, I could still hear the scratching of my tail behind the walls. A part of me feared that if I wasn't vigilant, whatever was lurking in that house would find me again, or that one day, it would never truly let me go. I may have escaped physically unscathed, but my psychology carries the scars of what I went through. The oppressive darkness, the twisted doorknob in the middle of the night, and the silent oppressive presence behind the walls still linger in my memory. I remember feeling the weight of silence in that space. The lights flickered, like a vacuum, where each step bounced off the high ceilings and distant walls. I'm used to working every night, used to the echo of my own footsteps, always checking corners just to make sure there's nothing lurking in the shadows. But that night, it felt different. There was an oppressive pressure in the air, an uneasy feeling that I wasn't the only one haunting these hallways. I spied the emergency light in the far hallway, which flickered ominously. The fading pale light illuminated a narrow section of wall, revealing years of scratched paint and grime that people rarely walked through. At first, I thought it was just a loose connection or an old light bulb, nothing unusual. But the way it flickered erratically made me feel butterflies in my stomach, anxiety crawling up my spine. As I approached, I heard a tap-tap sound echoing throughout the hallway, possibly the sound of water dripping from one of the exposed pipes above. The building is old, and random noises like this are normal. But there was something about its rhythm that made my heart pound. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the flickering light above my head. I pulled a small ladder closer, carefully climbed up and began removing the old light bulb. While I worked, I glanced down the hallway to make sure nothing was strange. Forklifts and pallet jacks sometimes get left out, and I don't want to get in someone's path. That's when I saw it, a shadow on the far wall, clearly human in shape, standing perfectly still. I was stunned. At first, I assumed it was my own shadow created by the sporadic lighting, but the angle was completely wrong. I leaned left, leaned right, and my arm wiggled a bit, but the shadow didn't move. It remained as still as a black mark on the concrete, as if it was looking at me. My pulse raced, my fingers felt wet on the steps. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that maybe there was another light source behind me, or some perspective trick. But when I glanced around, there was nothing except the lamp hanging overhead and the flashing emergency light bulbs. As I continued to unscrew the old lamp, I caught a glimpse of the shape that had moved, not very far, but enough to realize that it was not a graceful change, but more like a sudden jerk. It had stepped over the wall and was now floating, half inside, half outside. I almost dropped the replacement bulb. My heart was beating so loudly, I could feel it in my ears. It was painful. I forced myself to breathe through my nose to stay calm. The light bulb needed to be replaced, and I focused on that task, thinking that once I had steady light, I could see better. When I inserted the new bulb into the socket and tightened it, the hallway lit up in harsh fluorescent light. I looked back at the wall. The shadow was gone. Every hair on my body stood up, even though the shape had disappeared. I feel certain that I am not alone. The hallway seemed to breathe with me, as if it were alive and aware of me. My palms were sweaty, and my heartbeat was pounding in my throat. I told myself that exhaustion was playing tricks, maybe I needed a rest. But I couldn't shake the lingering fear that clung to me like a second skin. As I climbed down and returned the ladder to the maintenance closet, I passed by one of the break rooms. A colleague is in there, finishing a cup of coffee. He glanced at me, and indirectly asked if I was okay when he noticed I looked pale. I just smiled wryly, said nothing, and left. I nodded and mumbled something about a strange flashing light that startled me. He shrugged, sympathetically, and said the old hallways could be creepy at night. He didn't seem alarmed, so I tried to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched refused to go away. Determined to keep to my routine, I took a tour through various production areas. Conveyor belts and machinery rattled and overhead lights buzzed like insects. I checked each station's gauges and recorded the readings in my logbook. It felt like the whole factory was living and breathing with me, a hidden rhythm that I couldn't explain. The sounds kept echoing, and I swore I just saw something, or someone, out of my peripheral vision. It is always a fleeting shadow, lurking around a corner for a moment, or hidden behind a stack of crates. Every time I turned around, I found nothing but empty passages. Paranoia began to form in my mind, and my breathing became shallower every time I entered a dimly lit area. My hands were shaking, and sweat drenched my back. The whole factory felt wrong, as if it was beating with a hidden heartbeat, in sync with my own panic attacks. Several times, I stopped to listen, certain I would hear footsteps behind me. Each time, I only heard the steady hum of distant machinery. By 2 a.m., I was back near that hallway, feeling the need to check again, to prove to myself that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the shadow I saw. The new emergency lights flickered, shining everywhere, making the hallway almost too bright in that single piece. Everywhere else was in darkness. I stood there, my eyes running along the wall, noticing the chipped tiles and rust stains near the floor. A strange stench lingered in the air, like old metal and damp fabric. My stomach tightened as I stood there, the emergency lights flashing like a faint pulse, and in that split second, I saw the shadow reappear. It's not on the wall. This time, the shadow appeared to be standing several feet away, not attached to any physical form. I could see it hovering there, a silhouette with indistinct outlines, darker than the surrounding darkness. I could have sworn it was facing me, even though it had no discernible features. A wave of paralyzing fear spread through my body, and my muscles were so tense that I could barely move. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last as I felt my breath hitch. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. For a moment, I considered running away from that thing, but a strange enchantment bound me in place. I'd like to understand it, or at least confirm that it's really there. My mind scrambled for reasonable explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a temporary phenomenon on my retina. But I still see it, motionless, unable to deny its presence. The overhead light flickered again, and in the brief flicker of darkness, the shadow disappeared. I forced myself to move, step by step, the fight against the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My breathing became ragged, my lungs tight as if I were running a marathon. My mouth felt dry, and my tongue stuck to the roof. In my mind, that image kept replaying, wondering what I had seen. Is it a person? If so, where do they go? What am I dealing with? I drifted into a maintenance area next to the hallway, where the walls were LED lit with tool racks and repairs were half done. My plan was to check that everything was okay, hoping the familiarity of the tools would set me up. But when I entered, the overhead light was off, leaving only the faint hum of some machine. I heard another sound below, a rhythmic drip as if someone was tapping a metal pipe somewhere above. My fingers tingled with the desire to turn on every light in the room to dispel the gloomy darkness creeping in the corners. I started to feel a slight pressure in my head, as if the air was diluting my vision. Faded for a moment, I shook my head to regain focus. That's when I caught a glimpse of movement near the tool rack. A shape lingered behind a row of shelves, staring at me through the gaps. I couldn't see any eyes, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My throat tightened, and I felt like a cornered animal. Every instinct screamed to run away. I stepped back, my chest almost unable to breathe. The shape slid out from behind the shelves, closer but still unidentifiable. It was as if the air had darkened, forming a warping and pulsing void, my heart beating so violently that I felt nauseous. My feet moved, and finally, they obeyed. I staggered back into the hallway, half running, half staggering, my footsteps echoing madly against the concrete floor with insane force at every turn. I felt a presence behind me, as if it was following just outside of my vision. My peripheral caught a bit of flickering or shimmering darkness, disappearing every time I turned around. Finally, I reached the main production floor. The cacophony of machinery felt like a blessing, a wall of sound that momentarily drowned out my fear. The workers are stationed, each busy with their work. They paid little attention to me as I approached, although a few seemed concerned by my distraught expression. One of them asked me indirectly if I needed to sit down. I nodded, deciding it would be best to rest for a while. I found a secluded corner behind stacked pallets, trying to steady my breathing. Clothes stuck to my wet skin, and my hands shook uncontrollably. The feeling of something watching me remained like a pair of eyes glued to the back of my skull. As the minutes ticked by, I tried to convince myself that perhaps I was overreacting, perhaps because the flashing lights and maze of hallways had left my imagination motionless. But every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow. My body couldn't stop shaking, and the hum of the factory became distant and hollow, as if I heard it underwater. Finally, I decided I couldn't spend the rest of my shift hunkering down. I need some kind of closure. Forcing my shaky legs to move, I walked back into that hallway, determined one last time to confront whatever was there, even if it was only in my mind. My urge to find answers overwhelmed my fear. At least by the time I reached the hallway, it was eerily silent. The new emergency light shined steadily, revealing every grimy detail of the walls. Long, thin shadows merged near the far end. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to step forward. Each step feels heavier than the last. When I was halfway there, I heard a faint whisper, as gentle as a breeze passing through the cracks. It's incomprehensible, but it raises the hair on the back of my neck. I stopped and looked around the hallway, waiting for the light to flicker once briefly, plunging the hallway into darkness. In it, the heartbeat almost stopped. I saw that shadow again, just a few inches away from me. This time, it was towering and pitch black. A blast of pure terror went through me. I staggered, almost out of control, my heart pounding like thunder. A wave of fight or flight erupted within me. Adrenaline demanded that I defend myself, but against that, my mouth went dry, my hands tingled, and my breathing sounded ragged to my ears. I stood firmly against the wall, and in the steady light, the shadow disappeared again. Only my own frantic breathing and the flickering light remained, even though I couldn't see anything. The feeling of another presence was overwhelming my instincts. Screaming that there was something just outside my vision waiting for my next move, I took a deep breath and tried to speak, though my voice came out as a hoarse hiss. I asked that if there was something there, it would appear on its own. The hallway remained silent, except for the sound of metal dripping in the distance, a wave of fear rolling over me, as if the whole building was holding its breath in anticipation. Finally, I realized that I couldn't stand that confrontation anymore. There is no question of courage anymore. As if the air had become thick, I felt a pressure pressing down on my chest. My mind, rational or not, believed that this place contained a presence that I could not explain. I turned around and walked away, forcing my shaky legs to carry me. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure. Behind me, all I saw was the steady glow of emergency lights, illuminating an empty hallway. I finished my shift feeling physically and mentally exhausted. My supervisor indirectly asked about my condition, regarding sweating and shaking hands. I gave a vague explanation about an accident that was about to happen to me, a piece of machinery. Not daring to say anything that would make me look confused, the truth had lingered somewhere in my mind, and I wasn't even sure if I believed it or not. I knew in my heart that whatever I saw was real, at least real enough to haunt me now. Whenever I look back, I can still feel that prickly sensation at the base of my skull, as if that shadow was still watching me from behind some invisible curtain. The hallway, whenever possible, when avoidance wasn't an option, I moved through it as fast as I could, keeping my eyes forward, trying my best not to look at the walls. But even as my gaze turned forward, I felt it there, a silent figure waiting on the periphery of my vision, testing my sanity. It never attacked me, never touched me in any tangible way, but the quietly oppressive aura it radiated was enough to make me nervous every time I was in that place. It became an ever-present threat in my mind, a question that kept me more alert: had I actually seen something supernatural, or had the long hours and isolation chipped away at my perception of reality? To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it still follows me. Sometimes I catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye in my own home, or on a dimly lit street, a fleeting shape, a fleeting movement, a chill in the air when there shouldn't be one. Every time my heart clenched and my breath caught in my throat, I convinced myself that it was just a trick of my mind, a product of lingering trauma. But a deep part of me wondered if I had really escaped the nagging doubt that the true horror, which is knowledge, need not manifest physically to become real. It can stay with you forever, embed coldly in your soul, reminding you of that shadow in the quiet hallway. And fully conscious, if it really was something beyond my ken, then perhaps it was still waiting in the factory, hidden among the flashing lights and humming machines, ready to appear when someone else felt a little too isolated, a little too scared, a little too alone in the terrifying night. But the night air was unusually thick, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to suffocate me with fear. Even the faint light of the moon shining above the forest preserve near my apartment seemed pale and sickly, more like a feeble lamp than any source of comfort. There's something about that strip of trees that always makes me stop, but lately, I've found myself returning home later than usual. My shifts last many hours, and every time I approach the parking lot that borders the woods, I feel like I'm not alone. The jagged silhouettes of the trees loomed over me, like silent sentinels, as if they were guarding a secret I never intended to reveal. My name is Victor. I'm an ordinary man who moved to this apartment to find some peace and quiet. Initially, I was delighted that my building backed onto a pristine forest. There's something almost comfortingly romantic about thinking that nature is just a few steps away. But recently, that feeling of comfort has turned into a persistent source of insecurity. It started out innocuously. I would park my car late at night, step out into the crisp evening air and think I saw movement among the trees, just flickering like a shadow. At first, I rushed out of my sight, thinking it was just a trick of the eye or the wind moving the bushes. But it doesn't stop. Some nights I swear I catch a glimpse of a figure leaning against a tree, almost like someone is peering out and then ducking back down as soon as I turn my head. Reason told me that it was probably a night watchman, or maybe some trespasser lost in the dark. But my skin was still prickly, and a chill in my gut lingered long after I did. I arrived safely at my doorstep on a special evening. I decided I was curious enough, and some stubborn pride forced me to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and strode into the tree line, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. Rays of light pierced the darkness, illuminating each gnarled root, each twisted fern, but there was no sign of a person. Humans cannot be mistaken. My heart fluttered, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I whipped my flashlight around in a mad arc, but all I saw were ancient tree trunks and thick tufts of leaves. After a minute of tense silence, I withdrew, feeling both foolish and strangely shaky. Over the next week, my routine remained unchanged. That feeling never leaves. It became a part of me, a darkness that always followed, always ready to make me afraid at any time. I still come home late, still park my car in the same spot, and every night I look around the forest. Sometimes, nothing happens, just the rustle of foliage in the wind, the quiet hum of distant traffic. Other nights, I swear I've seen it, the same shape lurking in the shadows. One time, I spotted what looked like a pale arm sliding out from behind a tree and disappearing as soon as I focused on it. My heart was pounding in my chest and my throat was dry. I can't explain why I'm so restless. It was just a fleeting movement, but there was something inherently wrong with it, as if I had seen a ghost. The rational part of my brain tried to reassure me that it could have been the sound of tree bark or moonlight, but the image of that pale, thin arm refused to leave me. As the days passed, my nerves began to fray. I feel sometimes watched, even during the day. I looked from the kitchen window toward that forest and felt invisible eyes return my gaze. A neighbor once asked me if I was okay, commenting that I looked pale. I brushed it off and said I was just tired, but that lingering feeling of being watched weighed heavily on my mind. My sleep became restless. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding for no apparent reason, convinced that something was standing outside my door, or just outside the thin curtain of the window. Of course there was no one there, just an empty hallway, an empty balcony. But in the distant background of my thoughts, the forest lingered like a dark promise, reminding me of that faint sigh and the light of a pair of pale feet on a particularly cold night. I arrived home with a tension headache throbbing behind my temples. The apartment parking lot was empty as usual, and the overhead lights flickered in that sinister way, sometimes fluorescent bulbs. I remember getting out of the car and immediately feeling a change in the air, as if everything had disappeared. It was unnaturally still. Even the gentle buzzing of insects seemed to fall silent. I looked towards the forest, my heartbeat climbing and freezing. A shape stood just behind the tree line. At first it was almost as tall as me and had the vague shape of a person. My chest felt tight. I picked up my phone, trying to use the camera light to get a better look, but the light didn't reach far enough to reveal more than a mass of indecipherable darkness. With my pulse racing, I inched closer. I could hear my breathing, ragged and shallow. Suddenly, echoing in my ears was a crunching sound of leaves, coming from the direction of the shape, as if it were shifting weight or stepping. A rush of adrenaline surged through me, and a wave of heat shot through my limbs. I wanted to call it out. Part of me believed that if I faced this presence, I could understand the fear. But my vocal cords felt numb. After what felt like an eternity, the shape vanished into darkness. No running, no broken branches, just a terrifyingly silent retreat. When I got to where it had been, I found nothing but a scattering of dry leaves amid the strong smell of damp earth. I scanned the surrounding phone light, but there was only empty forest. That's when I noticed I was sweating a lot despite the cold evening. My shirt stuck to my back, and my hands were shaking so much that the light from my phone vibrated on the ground. I forced myself to take a deep breath, even though each inhale felt like a razor in my lungs. I told myself I would go inside, lock the door, and forget everything. But when I turned around, I sighed. Much closer than before, passing in silence. It's right behind me. I turned around trembling, only to be met with darkness. Fear filled my veins, and I ran back to my unit without looking back. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I close my eyes, I turn back to the forest, hear the sigh, imagine something lurking. The next day, I tried to confide in an acquaintance who lived a few houses away. He listened politely as I explained the strange sights and claustrophobic feeling coming from the forest. He suggested that perhaps local wildlife was to blame. Animals can look like humans at night if light hits them in strange ways. Perhaps it was a deer or some lost pet. He tried to sound reassuring, but I noticed the way he avoided eye contact, as if my story confused him more than he cared. Admitted after that conversation. I don't feel any better. If anything made me feel uncomfortable, it just spiked. I suspect that I simply mistook the animal for human form. Every fiber of my being insisted this was something else. A few evenings later, dispelling my fears, the forest looked less threatening with the last rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves. I ventured in the same direction I went the first time, with my flashlight. The ground felt spongy under my sneakers, the air damp and cool. Tall bushes and wide tree trunks obscured my vision, and as I moved around them, a prickly feeling spread across my neck. It was that primal instinct again, telling me that I was not alone. My chest tightened when I discovered crudely made-up branches leaning against a huge pine tree. They almost form a shelter, or a half-danger, leaning towards me. Stepping closer, I swallowed the lump in my throat. Inside that arrangement there was a smell of rotting leaves and something else, a musty smell that made my stomach churn. I pushed aside a half-broken branch to look inside. There were damp old cloths on the ground and what might have been a chipped ceramic cup. My pulse beats faster. Someone has clearly spent time here, but who and why? Uncomfortably, I nodded to the notion of some stranger living in the woods near my house, or even just passing by, as uncomfortable but not impossible. But there's something wrong with this shelter. The arrangement of the branches suggests a strange, almost ritualistic pattern, as if they were placed deliberately, rather than banged together for a quick escape. The realization sent a bolt of fear through me. I backed away, almost tripping over a rod in my haste. My breathing became ragged and beads of sweat appeared on my forehead. I forced myself to go back to my unit. My nerves were very tense, but I tried to reassure myself that perhaps it was an abandoned campsite, or a local person trying to observe wildlife incognito. But the feeling of fear refused to let go. That night, my paranoia was relentless. I felt as if I was on the edge of a precipice, my mind reeling with questions half formulating and half remembering details. I started to second-guess everything. Am I really seeing an arm, or is it an illusion of light? Could the sigh be the wind escaping through the dense branches? The more I tried to rationalize it, the more my thoughts returned to the slanted arrangement of tree branches and the pungent smell in the forest, which seemed to radiate with a dark vitality. Even from inside my apartment, I couldn't shake the impression that someone was out there, watching. It was an uncomfortable few days of quiet, during which I tried to distract myself with chores and watching meaningless TV shows, but I was always acutely aware of the forest's presence, especially after dark. I found myself looking out the window more often to check for movement among the trees. My heart was pounding for no reason. My palms were cold, as if I was always preparing for something terrible. Sleep is becoming more and more difficult to grasp. I woke up startled because I believed I heard leaves crunching right outside the window. My skin would feel cold, a wave of tingling would travel from my scalp to my heels. In a state of extreme anxiety, one incident finally shattered any remaining sense of normalcy. I was walking home again under the cover of night, darting nervously toward the tree line, the flickering parking lot light seeming weaker than ever, illuminating my path as I reached the place I usually stopped. A familiar rustling sound caught my attention, my muscles tensed. I shined my phone's flashlight into the bushes and then I saw, or perhaps it allowed itself to see, a tall figure standing behind one of the arms of the thicker trunk, holding up the bark. It seemed almost painful, like its fingers were digging into the wood. I can't get lost in the shadow. In one fluid movement it slides around the tree trunk, appearing in the darkness. I don't remember dropping the phone, but I heard it hit the asphalt. My mind screamed to run, but my legs were locked in place. One started when I was thrown out the door. There was someone in the hallway outside my unit. The floorboards outside my door crunched at a slow, deliberate rhythm as if footsteps were going back and forth. I stood on the other side, pressed against the tiers of the wood as I dared to look through the hallway that I felt were all trapped. Dozed briefly on the couch because I woke up with a kick to find light streaming through the curtains. A wave of relief and exhaustion washed over me. Oh, I spent that morning convincing myself I needed to face this presence, whatever it was, and ask for my peace of mind. I made up my mind. I was between bated breaths. I was there for almost an hour wandering among the other trees. I called out to myself, if someone is there, show yourself, but in the end I returned home disappointed and tired. Just before sunset, I noticed something disappear. My blood froze. I was in my zone, then turned around to put pins and needles in my bag. I decided right then and there I had to leave. At least, I packed a small bag, which shook as I threw clothes and essentials inside. All the while, I felt like I was outside. When I reached the door, I stopped halfway, expecting to see that number in the hallway, but it was empty. My footsteps echoed as I hurried to the elevator. The trip down seemed interesting. I felt it again, the suffocating feeling of watching, the shadows in the forest swirling into an impenetrable wall of black. I feel like I can't get enough air. Forced to move, I see a pale arm or a head moving in the darkness, changing. Maybe it's a person, or maybe it's my imagination. The feeling hit my ears and I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. Without a second thought, I got angry and left the not-so-scary place behind me. Not knowing exactly what I encountered followed me. As I retreated, it haunted me in the moments between sleep and waking, whispering that it was still out there, waiting for my return. Even though I put miles between myself and that apartment, I couldn't escape the feeling of dread that felt like a cold breath to my ears, a reminder that real or not some horror refused to fade. Even though I had escaped that place, I was left with disturbing knowledge that I had only postponed. Part of me still looked out the window and wondered if that was the number. There is still an eternal watchman, silently measuring every beat of my heart every night in this old building. The air seemed to become thick and the darkness settled as if it were charged with my tension. Behind the glass, I told myself it was just the age of the building. Perhaps the wiring is of poor quality or the wind vibrates the old frames. But once I moved in and discovered that the top floor was nothing more than a creepy area, I realized that the strange activity there caused me to return, again, to face the unexplained. The top floor seemed like ideal privacy in the middle of a bustling city center. But from that first night, I realized my new living situation might be more than I thought. I remember in bed that first evening, there were methodical steps, crossing from one side of the ceiling to the other. There shouldn't be anyone there, especially in the middle of the night and certainly not in what's supposed to be an empty terrace. But the steps that were unmistakable in their weight and the pace I had been trying stopped, and for a moment I began to relax. But just as the body slows down, the footsteps are continued to return in the opposite direction. The tension returned to my temples and I lay there, paralyzed as I realized that something had moved around on itself. The man with a permanent scowl etched into his face explained that the top floor was unoccupied. He insisted it was just a barren terrace and no one went up there except to check for leaks or to repair the old water tank. Even as I described him, he told me that I just needed to prove to myself that the sounds of the night were just a figment of my overactive imagination. But the light immediately gave off a heavy sense of walking in the pit of my stomach, as if the darkness itself had weight and my presence accelerated my pace. Ragged, I could feel my beats pounding in my ears, each beat like a heritage drum, something I couldn't see. My palms began to sweat and I gripped my blanket so tightly that my knuckles went numb. I was too scared to make any mention of unexplained events or long-standing tenants. But the records were sparse. The caretaker waived my requests, only reiterated that the top floors were off-limits and for many years my shoulders. The atmosphere seemed thick and heavy, as if each breath I took made a loud noise in this quiet space. My heart raced as I stared at the walls around me, walls full of peeling paint and burned-out light bulbs. The sound of myself, each frantic step on the wooden floor, sounded like a tapping in the dense silence. I clenched my hand over my mouth, trying to steady my breathing, as if any warning might be lurking just behind. My exhaustion increased by the hour. With each passing minute, I felt like I was swimming in an invisible sea of fear, a fear welling up inside me that I couldn't control. All of these feelings began to spill over into my daily life. I gradually became convinced that everything around me was shrouded in a deep darkness that I could not understand. One night, I was standing in front of the terrace door, my eyes fell on the rusty metal door lock. I tried pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of my hand colliding with it echoed in the quiet space, and my heart beat harder than ever. My caretaker had confirmed that the terrace door was usually locked, but something in what he said made me feel like he was hiding something. I felt a heavy fear rising in my body. It felt like something was watching me, but I couldn't see clearly. I spent that morning convincing myself that I needed to face this presence. Whatever was there, I had to meet it head-on so I could end this fear. When night came, I decided to check the terrace door again. Every step I took felt like tension rising in every muscle. I listened to my footsteps echo in the vast space, but there was only the howling wind as a warning. When I reached the terrace door, I fumbled around looking for the lock. My palms were sweaty and my hands were shaking as I tried to open the door. When the door opened, I walked in and felt the light from my flashlight bounce off the dim lampposts and hidden corners of the terrace. I turned around, the light from the flashlight touched each object but no one was there. Just me, and invisible sounds. The cold wind made me shiver, but there was no sign of life. I stood in the middle of it, feeling every heartbeat pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, terrifyingly silent. And when I looked back, I realized something horrifying. The footsteps I heard might not have been human. It could be something invisible, wandering in the dark. As I rushed back to the apartment, a heavy feeling followed me like a shadow. My heart pounded as I realized that, even though I had closed the door, it was still out there, in the dark, inexplicable, impossible to grasp. I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. These feelings, these noises and shadows that I always feel, cannot be ignored. I need to leave. But something inside me knows that, no matter where I go, it will still stick with me, still making it impossible for me to escape that obsession. I gathered my things in a hurry, my heart still pounding in my throat, and my ears still ringing with footsteps that I couldn't explain. In the end, I couldn't stay here anymore. This apartment was not just a refuge, but a place where I lost myself. Leading me deeper into the darkness, into an unexplainable space. Every step I took, I felt invisible footsteps following me, as if someone was watching my every move in the large library, where the faint light from old light bulbs was not enough to dispel this gloom. I try to focus on my work, but my mind cannot escape the stress and stuffiness from the surrounding space. Those rustling sounds, inexplicable, seem to follow me, a reminder of the strange, incomprehensible presence lurking in the darkness of the room. The smell of mold and wet soil in the air made me feel like I was walking through an abandoned area, a place forgotten in time. My hands trembled as I tried to organize the manuscripts and place them in the filing cabinet. The feeling of darkness, of absolute silence, permeated my body, making it impossible for me to escape the feeling that I was being watched, that I was not alone in this space. When I stopped, my breathing became rapid, I felt heavy footsteps, as if someone was following me. I closed my eyes, convincing myself that it was just stress, fatigue that was making me imagine things. But every time I opened my eyes, the darkness grew thicker, and the silence became even more eerie. Again, I continued walking towards the source of the sound. With every step I take on the stairs, I feel like I'm stepping back into the past, into an area where light cannot reach. A feeling of fear rose within me as I realized that I could not escape this vicious cycle. And when I finally arrived at the place where the sound was coming from, there was nothing but a dark, cold space where no one was. But I knew, somewhere in the darkness, something was watching me, waiting for me to walk into a trap I couldn't understand. Like a hunted animal, I quickly turned around, feeling like that shadow continued to follow me, lurking in the shadows of the library. I can't articulate what I feel, but I know one thing for sure, I can't stay here any longer. All I wanted to do was leave, but I knew that this feeling, the feeling of being watched, would never go away. And the cold felt like it didn't belong to this world. I cannot explain how such a thing could exist in a building full of books and old wood, where logic and reason were displayed on every page, every book. But every time I tried to deny it, every time I convinced myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination, I felt that presence again, heavy and inevitable. That evening, as I sat back at my desk, the cold feeling gradually became numb throughout my body. I tried to continue working, but trivial noises from dark corners and strange winds rushing through the windows made it impossible to concentrate. The nights became longer, quieter, and the air grew heavier. Unexplainable sounds rang out again, light footsteps, strange objects moving. When I leave the table, I have to go through that staircase again, where the darkness is always so black as if it swallows all the light. Every step felt like a challenge, my heart beating strongly in my chest, but I still couldn't ignore the strange images and feelings of the third floor. That hand, that shadow, it always haunts me, appearing and disappearing in just a split second. I couldn't be sure that I actually saw them, but those feelings, the cold, the feeling of being seen, couldn't have been simply a hallucination. The volunteer talked about the noises, unpleasant smells, and unusual signs, and when he did, I felt a silent acknowledgement of the unrest in this place. I wasn't alone in feeling this way, but the fact that there was something disturbing made it even more difficult for me to shake off those feelings. And then, when I left the library one dark night, I knew I wouldn't go back alone again. The footsteps, the shadows, the memories of something I couldn't understand, it was all too real for me to continue to ignore. Something is still waiting in the shadows, in the windows, in the dusty shelves of this library, and I can't run away from it, no matter how hard I try. That feeling of fear kept following me, no matter how hard I tried to hide it or ignore it. No matter how long it took, the presence of those shadows and blurry images still did not leave me. It's not a complete obsession, but it's an indelible reminder, like an invisible mark that I can't deny. Volunteers and others may not have seen anything strange, but for me, it was a silent, uncomfortable feeling that lingered in the building's atmosphere. Whenever I passed through the library's corridors, the light became dimmer, the rustling sounds from books, from the wind blowing through the doors, all seemed to remind me in unison of the shadow that I couldn't explain. Sometimes I wonder if those shadows are a product of anxiety, or incomprehensible things, things I can only perceive in sudden moments of silence. There are nights, when I sit quietly at the table, I feel them near, shadows that cannot be seen but make me always turn around and check every corner of the room. The memories of my pale hands still haunt me. And no matter how hard I tried to explain that it was just my imagination, the fear still wouldn't go away easily. It has become a part of me, an inseparable part of my experience in this place. Sometimes, when I wander alone, I tell myself that I have to face it, but when I step into a quiet space, where there is no one, I hear small noises, movements that I cannot explain. Every time like that, I feel like I'm not alone, there's something still waiting in the darkness, something that I can't understand, but is always present, even if only in a hidden corner. And so, I continue to live and work in this space. I know that I can't banish fear completely, but I also can't give up. As the days passed, I became accustomed to the presence of the shadows, even though I knew that they would never leave me, and that I would always have to live with their silent threat, until I accepted that presence as a part of life. The feeling of confusion still does not let me go. That shadow, even though it was only a faint shape, still lingered in my mind like a persistent nightmare. Every step I took in the building, every time I passed through an empty hallway, the feeling of being watched came back. I couldn't escape the thought that something was watching, somewhere I couldn't see, in the darkness and silence. The elevator finally reached the basement, and I just wanted to leave, just wanted to escape the stuffiness, the tension, the feeling like something was chasing me. But as soon as I walked out, when I turned around to look at the elevator, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no one, no silhouette in that corner anymore, but I still felt like there was something invisible waiting. It didn't leave, it simply hid in space, in a darkness that I couldn't explain. The sweat on my forehead was still there, even though the air in the basement was not hot. I felt like I was swimming in a suffocating ocean, where every step brought me closer to a truth I didn't want to face. My mind tried to argue that it was just stress, a long-term fatigue, but the feelings I was experiencing could not be easily ignored. And just like that, every time I return to that place, whether it is night or day, I cannot avoid the feeling that there is something, an invisible darkness still clinging to me, still watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The feeling of fear did not let me go, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything could be explained. But the fear kept growing, as if something unexplainable existed beyond what I could see. Every time I return to that building, I feel that presence, like a darkness that never leaves, waiting every time I let my guard down. Every night, I was faced with the dead silence of the hallways. The light was weak, long shadows stretched across the walls like wounds in an old building. And every time I pass them, I can't help but feel that something is watching me. When I stand alone in the elevator, Sometimes I just feel a shadow passing by. I feel the tension, the air feels compressed and thickened by an invisible force. The next time I went back and watched the security office video again, I saw myself, eyes lost, looking around nervously. But there is no one else. There was no shadow, no one standing next to me, although I definitely saw something. Reality and imagination begin to blur together, like a fog that is difficult to separate. And no matter how hard I tried to explain, I couldn't erase the feeling that something was chasing me. Every step I heard in the quiet hallways was like the footsteps of someone, but I never dared to look back. Even as I tried to continue working, facing my fears and the reality I was living in, I couldn't escape it. The cold feeling I felt when walking through quiet areas of the building, or the flashing lights, all reminded me of that presence. And I can't help but wonder, can I continue to live under that threat forever, or will I one day be consumed by it, like the shadows that always follow me from behind? The feeling of fear came again like a strong wave, covering me, even after I had completed my mission. The dim light in the elevator and the inexplicable shadow made me doubt what I had seen. Every step echoed in the hall, as if someone was following me, and my heart pounded in my chest. Every time I turn around, I feel a presence behind me, like an eternal shadow that never leaves. Even though I could look into the empty hallway, the feeling always followed me, lingering in every hidden corner. The building seemed to have changed in my eyes, from an ordinary place to a space filled with fear and confusion. Every corner, every sound, even the smallest, makes me tremble in fear. Reality and my imagination began to blend together, and I couldn't distinguish between truth and illusion. I wonder if I can continue to live in such a space, where every step could be the footsteps of someone watching me in the dark. Determined to find relief, I decided to talk to my manager the next day, ask to change shifts or even quit my job, if this feeling couldn't stop. But as I walked out of the hall, heavy footsteps echoed behind me, matching my rhythm. No explanation could explain this, and I began to feel that the presence would never let me go. Fear and confusion arose, but there was nothing I could do but keep walking, in the hope that one day I would find answers to these inexplicable things. Despite my efforts to clean up and leave the place, the memory of the building refused to leave me. Every night when I try to sleep, images of dark hallways, flickering lights, and strange figures in elevators return. I changed jobs, moved to another place, but my mind was never completely free of those feelings. These experiences, even without any physical evidence, still haunt me, making me unable to believe what my eyes saw and what I could not explain. The shadow in the elevator, the eerie silence in the hallways, all were part of a secret I couldn't uncover. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it as a product of a tired imagination or a stress-induced hallucination, a deep part of me insisted that I had seen something that could not be explained. With each passing night, the fear still smolders inside me, a reminder that sometimes, there are things that cannot be explained, shadows that exist only when we cannot see them, and they are always there, waiting, until we are weak. The truth is not always visible to the naked eye, and sometimes, secrets can only be realized in our moments of weakness. I wish I could forget it all, but every time I look into the dark corners of a room or an empty hallway, I can't help but wonder, have I really gotten rid of it or is it still waiting? It just hasn't appeared again? The air in the room seemed thicker and colder than I imagined, and the damp smell of old wood made me feel even more strange. I stood there, my whole body tense in the silence. It seemed like there was something in the air waiting for me, but I couldn't see or hear anything clearly other than the steady sound of the rain. That feeling, that I wasn't completely alone in this house, made me feel cold inside and out. That feeling returned, the familiar anxiety as I returned to my bedroom, not even daring to look at the old mirror in the corner of the room. Part of me knew that the mirror had long been associated with this house, but now it was a source of fear and insecurity. I decided not to face it anymore. My footsteps sounded softly as I left the room, deciding to go out onto the porch, where I could breathe in some fresh air to dispel the stuffy feeling. The outer door opened a crack, and I walked in, feeling the cold air from the rain mix with my skin. But whether outside or inside, the feeling of being watched never left me. Faint, dim lights seemed to illuminate the surrounding darkness, and I felt them stretching out, as if waiting for me. No matter how hard I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't erase those questions from my mind. Is there anything really there? And if there is, have I passed it by without realizing it, or is it a figment of my weary imagination? Every breeze, every faint sound only increased my tension and anxiety, making it impossible for me to relax, as if I were always living in a never-ending nightmare. I went back to the bedroom, deciding not to look in the mirror, letting the shadow surround me. Sleep, even if it comes, will certainly not be easy, like the nightmares full of shadowy figures that have haunted me all night long. I felt as if that mirror had touched my mind, imprinted itself in my head, as if a part of me had been taken over by it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that blurred face, standing still in the darkness of the room, as if it were watching my every move. The feelings of stress and anxiety continued like a never-ending wave, weighing me down, even when I tried to stay away from it. I left the house, temporarily separated from it, but every step I took still felt watched. Even in the morning, when sunlight shines on my car, I still feel that presence, invisible but clearly felt. An unpleasant feeling, like a darkness that cannot be touched, but always hovers next to me, haunts me every time I turn around, every time I look in the mirror. Every time I looked in the mirror, I felt that insecurity return, as if the mirror contained not only images but also scary memories that I couldn't explain. I couldn't escape the feeling that a part of me, a dark part, had been released from that mirror and was watching me from a hidden corner, just waiting for me to miss a breath, a moment of weakness for it to appear again. Even though I left the house and found a new space, that presence still did not leave me. It continued to linger, even in my dreams, where the mirror and that face reappeared, reminding me of a horror I could not understand. A vague sense of presence, something intangible, followed me throughout the journey. Strange noises, faint shadows in the weak light, all blend together into an inexplicable picture. The feeling of being watched, like a shadow hovering around me, haunted me constantly. The strange streets, abandoned houses, and closed doors made me unable to escape the strange feeling that something was waiting for us ahead. When we stopped at a small cluster of trees, I couldn't help but feel the suffocation of the surrounding space. The image was blurred between the trees, the shadow stood still and motionless, making it impossible for me to recognize what it was, but I knew for sure that it was the man I had seen before. The feeling of fear and tension skyrocketing inside me made me want to run away, but I couldn't leave. The dim lights and curves of the deserted road all made me feel like I was walking into an invisible trap. When I finally left that place, I couldn't erase the image of the man and the strange feelings inside me. That shadow, that cold look from him still lingers in my mind. And even when we found a strange town, a place that seemed out of this world, I still couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right, that we hadn't truly escaped the nightmare we'd created for ourselves. That night, when we stopped in the small, musty room, I couldn't sleep. The musty smell in the air, the chirping sounds of insects outside, all made me feel like there was an inexplicable presence around me. The feeling that everything is waiting for something to happen, that something invisible is standing quietly in the dark, waiting. I don't know if I can survive this nightmare, but I know for sure that that presence, that shadow, will never completely leave me. The feeling of insecurity and anxiety cannot be dispelled. I cannot escape the ghosts that seem invisible, always following, always present even when I try to convince myself that it is just due to the stress and fatigue of my body. The feeling that something invisible was watching, that presence, not that of anyone I knew, but of something else, beyond my understanding, made me uneasy. The traces in the wet soil along the riverbank, the twisted tree branches, they aroused in me an indescribable fear. Everything around me seemed to be quietly rearranging itself, reminding me that I wasn't completely safe, that there was something waiting, hidden in the shadows that I couldn't explain. I tried to fight the fear, convincing myself that it was just my overactive imagination, but I couldn't deny that that presence was always lurking, always in a hidden corner that I couldn't see clearly. Unpredictable shapes on the fire, figures twisting and stretching in the dim light of the night, they made me feel as if this world was gradually disintegrating, merging into a space that could not be clearly defined. Once again, I was faced with doubt and fear, as if I were gradually becoming part of a nightmare that I had created. I couldn't ignore the tension in my body, I couldn't explain the pressure in my heart. No matter what I tried, that feeling stayed with me, haunted me, and whenever I thought I was free of it, it came back to me. The feeling of insecurity and silent surveillance still clung to me, never leaving, even though I left the campsite, the trees, and the dark night behind. That shadow, even though I couldn't see it, I felt it, something that accompanied me, lingering around, like something beyond my understanding. Wherever I went, even in the middle of the city, I couldn't let go of the feeling that something strange was following me, lurking in the darkness of my own thoughts and hallucinations. Invisible signs, like inexplicable footprints in the dirt, or strange symbols carved into tree bark, only deepened that feeling, making me doubt the actual nature of what had happened. And even when I found peace somewhere strange, fear refused to let go. That shadow, although invisible, always exists in my mind, like a persistent nightmare that cannot be dismissed. That feeling still sticks with me, no matter where I go or what I do, and I can't help but wonder when it will truly end. Still, I couldn't relax, couldn't forget that presence, and I knew that at any moment, in a moment of weakness, it would reappear, watching me from the shadows. And with each trip, each road, I become more certain that I am never truly alone, even though it may seem like I am. An uneasy feeling welled up as I stood there, in the darkness of the old warehouse, with the air dim and stuffy, my eyes nervously scanning the space, looking for anything suspicious. The scratches on the wooden floor made me feel as if something was here, moving in the darkness carefully, almost stealthily. I tried to reassure myself that it was probably just traces of previous uses, but deep down, I felt something was wrong. Something in that darkness was watching me, waiting. The warehouse door was pushed open with a sharp hiss, the smell of damp earth and mold surrounded me, reminding me of the strange feelings I had before. I began to feel as if something in the air, in this very warehouse, was trying to draw me into an inexplicable mystery. The longer I looked, the clearer it became that there was something wrong with the old tools thrown haphazardly in this dark room. The weak light from my flashlight only illuminated the dark corners, but not enough to make me feel safe. Every little sound, every movement startled me, and a feeling arose in my heart that I couldn't shake. When I entered, I felt cold from a place that had been forgotten for a long time. I began to feel as if something was watching me, standing quietly in the dark. The flashlight's light tried to subdue the surrounding darkness, but scratches on the floor raised suspicions. How could they be so new, if not the traces of someone who was here before me? I can feel this presence, even though it doesn't appear in a clear form. With every step I took, I felt more tense, and as if an invisible force was making the air heavier and harder to breathe. The inevitable feeling of threat made me stop, and in that moment, a faint rustling sound rang out from a dark corner. It was not the sound of insects or the wind. It was a sound too intentional, too obvious for me to ignore. When I shined the flashlight into the dark corner, I only saw darkness, but that cold feeling seemed to be growing. In that moment, I understood that there was something unexplained in this space, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was trespassing into a place where strange things were waiting to be discovered. The light from the flashlight faded, and I was left with only a feeling of fear surging through my body. Even if I want to leave, I know that these traces will not leave me easily. A feeling of tension enveloped me as I stood there in the darkness of the warehouse, the weak light of my flashlight unable to dispel the stuffiness in the air. The scratches on the wooden floor were still evident, but they now seemed to have a strange significance, as if they had been made by something standing on two legs, rather than an animal. I tried to calm my mind, but the truth was I couldn't. The smell of damp earth and inky air made me feel as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. The feeling of static electricity running down my arm made me feel as if someone was standing behind me, watching me in the dark. Every little sound, from the rustle of scratches to the sound of my own breathing, made me feel more and more lost in a world beyond my control. I turned around, the flashlight light went out and I felt the coldness clawing at my body again. Everything around me went black, as if this warehouse were a deep hole swallowing me whole. I looked at the scratch higher on the wall, and for a moment, I could feel a presence behind me. Something that cannot be seen, but can certainly be felt. I couldn't separate the feeling of fear from the doubts in my head, that maybe I wasn't just dealing with regular scratches but something else. An entity, or a phenomenon, that I cannot understand. Uneasiness grabbed me. I had only one choice, to leave. But I couldn't turn back. I couldn't leave without knowing that something was there, in the darkness, waiting for me. My legs disobeyed, but I couldn't stop. The flashlight went out again, and I hurried out of the warehouse, feeling the cold night air wrap around me, as if it were holding me captive. Once again, I looked back at the warehouse. The images and sounds in my head flashed like ghosts, things that couldn't be explained. They followed me, in every step, in every breath, as if they were deeply ingrained in my mind and would never leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting for a chance to step out of the darkness. Your story creates a constant sense of tension and suspense. Every detail makes the reader tense and anxious. Every step, every sound is clearly described, making us feel the fear and ambiguity surrounding the character. Scratches, strange sounds, and unexplained presences from the darkness all contribute to the uneasy feeling the main character is experiencing. The old warehouse with strange signs has become a symbol of insecurity, where the main character cannot be sure whether what he sees is a hallucination or whether something supernatural really exists. Everything seems to revolve around something inexplicable, making it impossible for the character to find a satisfactory answer. The connection between reality and paranoia is described very delicately, and the truth is that it is the silence, the stopping of everything, that makes the character feel most insecure. These moments make the reader feel like they are being drawn into a space with no escape, where everything could be part of a terrifying secret waiting to be discovered. The character not only faces fear in the warehouse but also faces doubt and fear within himself. This uncertainty makes the story intriguing and full of mystery, and also keeps the reader from thinking about what is really going on. The feeling of fear following the character like something that cannot be thrown away makes the story even more haunting. Our story ends here, but the feelings and thoughts it brings may still follow you, just like the darkness still follows our footsteps. Memories, no matter how mysterious or scary, have a way of haunting and reminding us that there are things beyond our understanding. Thank you so much for being with us throughout this journey. Thank you for listening and sharing the emotions this story brings. Hopefully these stories are not just images of the imagination, but also lessons about resilience, about facing fear and discovering the mysteries that this world can offer.